guys, so the tritone substitution is probably the most widely known and widely used chord substitution in jazz. Now, it's a way of substituting a dominant 7 chord by moving the root a tritone away. So for example, a G7 becomes a D flat 7. And it works because the guide tones, that is the 3rd and the 7th of each chord, stay the same, but they swap around. That is, the 3rd of G7 becomes the 7th of D flat 7, and the 3rd of D flat 7 becomes the 7th of G7. Now, if, for example, you're improvising over a 2-5-1 in the key of C, so the chords being D minor 7, G7 to C major 7, most people would play D Dorian over the D minor 7, G Mixolydian over the G7, and C Ionian over the C major 7. So essentially you're playing C major 7 over that entire chord progression. But what if you tritone substitute the G7? So your chord progression becomes D minor 7 to D flat 7 to C major 7. Then suddenly your G Mixolydian scale doesn't quite fit over that D flat 7 chord. And that's because G Mixolydian has a C in it, which is a major 7th from the point of view of the D flat, whereas we're playing a flat 7, a minor 7th in the dominant chord, and so it clashes. Now, of course, you could play D flat Mixolydian, which is G flat major, over the D flat 7 chord for that one bar. But what if we have a chord progression that goes D minor 7 for a full bar, then G7 for half a bar to D flat 7 for half a bar, down to C major 7. So this creates a bit of a delayed cadence, with the D flat acting as an approach chord between the 5 and the 1. And this is quite often seen in jazz. So you could play half a bar of G Mixolydian and half a bar of D flat Mixolydian, but then you're changing scales for half a bar, which can be quite a challenging thing to do at a really fast tempo. And then what if you're just soloing and you've got someone else, like a guitar player, comping for you, that is playing the chords. So you don't know what they're actually going to play. They could play a full bar of G7 or a full bar of D flat 7, or half a bar of G7 and D flat 7 going to that one chord. So a G Mixolydian mode doesn't quite fit over a D flat 7, and a D flat Mixolydian doesn't quite fit over a G7 because it's got an F sharp. So wouldn't it be great if there was a scale that could fit over both the G7 and the D flat 7, so that regardless of what your compa or what the accompaniment is doing, this scale will work? And in fact, you do have a few such options. Now, the first thing you can do is still play that G Mixolydian mode, regardless of what chord is being played in the accompaniment, but just avoid the note C. Now, the note C is actually an avoid note for the chord G7, and it doesn't fit over the D flat 7. So it's not a good note for either chord, and so it's a good note to just omit and avoid completely. And that's a perfectly fine thing to do. It's nice and easy. You don't have to worry about changing scales midway through a chord progression, especially if you're moving at a fast tempo. All you really have to do is just avoid the note C for that bar. But there are a few scales that you can play that fit over both chords. The first one is the whole tone scale, either beginning from D flat or G, because they have the exact same notes. So then you could have something like this. Another one is the dominant diminished scale, again either beginning from the D flat or the G, because they're both equivalent. They have the same notes in them, they're the same scale. Another good scale you can use is the A flat melodic minor scale. Now, A flat melodic minor starting and ending on the G is the G altered scale. And A flat melodic minor starting and ending on the D flat is the Lydian dominant scale. Now both of those scales, the altered scale and the Lydian dominant scale, are good scales to use over a dominant 7 chord. So both of those are modes of the melodic minor scale, and I have a separate video which covers all the modes of the melodic minor scale, so you can check that out if you like. But both of those scales are used quite a lot over a dominant 7 chord in jazz, partially for this reason. You can tritone substitute the chord, but you don't have to change the scale because it fits quite well and it doesn't have any avoid notes. Now, in a similar vein, you could play D melodic minor, which means playing D flat altered scale and G Lydian dominant. Right, so all of those scales are great to use over dominant 7 chords because if someone is accompanying you, and they choose to tritone substitute a particular chord, if you use one of these scales, it doesn't matter. It still fits perfectly well. You're not going to clash by playing any kind of major 7 or avoid note or anything like that. Now I'll finish this video by saying a few more interesting things about tritone substitutions. So firstly, a G7 flat 5 has all the same notes as a D flat 7 flat 5. That is G, B, D flat and F. So a G7 flat 5 is its own tritone substitution. And the only way you can tell the difference is by looking at the bass note. If it's got a G in the bass, then it's a G7 flat 5. If it's got a D flat in the bass, then it's a D flat 7 flat 5. Now this is not a widely used chord, but you will find it occasionally, especially in some of Thelonious Monk's music. Another interesting thing is tritone substituting with rootless chord voicings. Now I have a separate video on rootless chord voicings, so check that out if you're interested. But essentially a rootless chord voicing for a dominant chord includes the 3, 7, 9 and 13. So a G7 would look like this. Now if you play a G7 sharp 9 flat 13, then that's a D flat 7 rootless chord voicing. So it's a tritone substitute. So technically a rootless G7 sharp 9 flat 13 is a rootless D flat 7. And finally, you will occasionally see 2 5s tritone substituted rather than just the 5 by itself. So a D minor 7 to G7 can become an A flat minor 7 to D flat 7 to C major 7. Now you can't technically tritone substitute minor 7 chords. They don't work in the same way as dominant 7 chords. So an A flat minor 7 is not a perfect substitute of a D minor 7. So then you should play a D Dorian over a D minor 7 and an A flat Dorian over an A flat minor 7, and then the same rules that I discussed earlier over the dominant chord. And keep in mind that these tritone substitutions of 2 5s can be mixed and matched. You can have a D minor 7 going to a D flat 7 or an A flat minor 7 going to a G7. Cool, so that's it for me. Thanks for watching. Hopefully this gave you a couple things to think about. And yeah, until next time, see ya.